All right. Welcome to JDC West's 2021 International Business Case presentation sponsored by RBC. A special thank you goes out to our judges, Jean-Pierre Pejot, Senior Manager, Sales and Marketing at Pollard Banknote, Herb Zobel, Vice President of Commercial Financial Services at RBC, Hayden Zammit, Manager of New Business Initiatives at Skip the Dishes, Randy Baldwin, President of Acorn Hill Partners. Competitors, you will have a maximum of 20 minutes to present. Immediately following the presentation, judges will have a total of 5 minutes to ask the presenters questions. I am our academic moderator who will be the timekeeper and control the overall flow of this presentation format. Time intervals will be noted in the Zoom chat by myself beginning at the 10-minute mark. Following the presentation, I will facilitate the question and answer period. Judges will indicate their intent to ask a question using the hand raised function, which I will call on them to indicate the next question. No questions or comments will be permitted from the audience at any time. The audience is also prohibited from communicating to the presenters in any forum, including Zoom or via other mediums during this presentation or the question period. If you are an observer, please ensure that your camera is off and that your microphone is muted. Once the question period has completed, this Zoom meeting will end. Competitors, you are now free to begin your presentation.
Thank you for joining us today. We are Team J, K2C Consulting, consisting of Cindy, Charlene, and myself, Kevin. And today what we want to offer you is the prospect of reaching for new horizons. And by the end of this 20-minute presentation, we're going to leave you with a direction in where to expand next after careful analysis, as well as a variety of tools to ensure that wherever you go, you'll succeed and ultimately form a new base to search for the next horizon. So let's dive right into it. Understanding what color space does well is really integral to understanding what we need to preserve across cultural barriers. And ultimately, two factors contribute to color space's core competency, and that's the focus on automation and efficiency, as well as the Kaizen culture that's permitting your workers to constantly improve processes and ensure that you're running the most efficient operations possible. And this has led you to be extremely profitable and be able in a position to grow to a huge geographic footprint in 8+ countries, sprawling over almost every corner of the globe. And ultimately, wholesalers choose color space for paint chips and paints because of market proximity, because of that geographic expansion, as well as the exceptional quality that you bring because of this operational excellence that these two processes bring to the table. Now, this operational excellence is threatened at the moment, however, and it has been for the past year or so, as we all know. COVID-19 and political flashpoints have created a world of uncertainty that we live in, and it's burdened color space through furloughs, temporary layoffs, and shutdowns. But at the same time, demand preferences have shifted towards local manufacturers, especially in the 3 countries that you outlined for your target market entry options. And so this corresponds perfectly with your market proximity advantage. And it's something that we hope to preserve throughout this expansion and keep at the core of Color Space's international business. So how can Color Space capture new geo-drivers while furthering this core competency of cross-cultural operational stewardship? Well, we're going to break it down into 3 key questions: where to play, how to enter, and how to win. First, where to play. Let's look at first the market dashboard of where exactly you're looking to expand. When you're evaluating this expansion, it's important to keep in mind that the long-term growth potential is what matters here and what's at stake. And so we need to ask ourselves the question, where does the demand lie? What's the outlook, excuse me? And so if we look at Colombia really quickly, it's an emerging paint market with regional development and a 4% CAGR to 2025, compared to Saudi Arabia, with demand mostly concentrated in drilling-related enamel coatings, something that paint chips aren't necessarily too relevant in, with a smaller growth of 3.5% CAGR. India, however, has 75% of its demand in decorative paints, with a booming construction industry, with a huge 8.56% CAGR all the way to 2025. And we also need to take into account some of the short-term considerations, even though long-term is primary. I'll go into more of an in-depth breakdown of the specific factors that go into the long-term in a second. But first, we need to take a moment to acknowledge the impact of COVID on not only payback periods and ROIs, but also how feasible it will be to implement. And so we need to understand that Colombia's situation doesn't seem very good, with an unclear vaccination plan and a new strain that's resistant to the vaccine recently discovered in Brazil, which shares a border with Colombia. Saudi Arabia has a slow vaccination plan to date, but it is something that is hopeful and looking to roll out sometime in the next couple of months, whereas India has a huge pharmaceutical boom during the COVID-19 pandemic, with the world's largest vaccination program rolling out as we speak, with 100 million doses per month projected. And so India appears most successful through these two initial analyses. And so let's put this all together and understand where exactly we lie and where color space should expand. If we understand the paint growth market, or the paint market growth has India at the top, and that with India as the largest market size according to the World Economic Forum. It's also heavily fragmented with a lot of small players, but it's also quite saturated at the same time. Saturation is something we're not looking for because of the fact that we want to capture emerging blue oceans. Despite this, nevertheless, India is still in a prime position with its better COVID outlook to be an optimal expansion for color space. Now let's get into some of the details in how to enter. We need to understand that color space's agency among other stakeholders is really important to consider here. In deciding the method of entry, we need to understand that color space needs to have autonomy and control in implementing its state-of-the-art Kaizen and automation processes. And financial prudence must also be top of mind. And the only option that really grants this is full ownership, therefore pointing us to acquisition, which again works really well with India's fragmentation because there's a ton of mid-sized targets available. And this is huge cost savings as well. Let's look at some of the supporting players here. The EDC, the Export Development Bank of Canada, is there to protect Canadian business interests abroad and will provide support services such as insurance and consulting while we're in India. As well as the Indian government has an interest to bolster their own domestic manufacturing to 25% of their GDP by 2022. And this is an important consideration to understand as we move forward. Finally, let's go into how to win. And this is specifically how color space's identity fits into India. When we understand Indian culture to be rather collectivist, relationship-based, and non-confrontational, we need to understand the need for a change management plan to reconcile these differences. As well as with automotive implementation, India is extremely arms wide for tech adoption, with an 11.6% CAGR in the adoption of automated technologies. And so with this support, there are many new opportunities that can come out of automation in India, making these external conditions very favorable for color space.
Thank you, Kevin. Now moving on to recommendations. We're going to be continuing to break it down in 3 different parts: where to play, how to enter, and how to win. Where to play, we're going to be recommending you to actually enter Mumbai, India. How to enter? So for where to play, we'll be choosing the right city for Color Space's international expansion. So in choosing to play in India, Color Space must pick the right city for its successful market entry. And this is something that is key because not all Indian cities are the same. So we've picked 2 different decision criteria. The first one being market proximity, as well as concentration of acquisition targets. And we found that Mumbai was the best choice for you. The reason for it is, one, something to note, it does have the highest population. And there's a big movement of coming from rural areas to the big cities in India. Another thing to note here is there's about 6% manufacturing growth in India, which is important because it will only help your business because you are a B2B business. It's also known for its developed paint industry. Lastly, too, it does have an EDC center in Mumbai, only one of the 2 present currently in India, which will only help you because India is a complex market and you will need these relationships. You will need EDC to help you prosper in India. So next up, how to enter. We want you to prioritize acquisition. So choosing how to enter will dictate Color Space's success in Mumbai, India. So there's key considerations here. One thing is you're already very familiar with acquisition. This is the way you've been expanding so far. Another thing to note here is this is a very uncertain time, and setting up infrastructure is very difficult under COVID because if you go for a greenfield expansion, You have to take into account that you're going to need a manufacturing plant, you're going to need to hire people, you're going to need to build relationships, and this is not easy today. Another thing to note here is financial prudence. Again, something that's really important. And therefore, we recommend you that Colorspace should enter through an acquisition. And an acquisition will mitigate risk put forth through a greenfield expansion. We'll also give Colorspace the possibility to further really solidify and expand on their core competency. Because we don't want you to waste time trying to have a greenfield expansion. We want you to go for an acquisition and be able to apply your core competencies for your long-term success. So a bit more about how to enter. There's other things that you need to consider. One thing is that India has an interest to grow its homegrown manufacturing. And this is important. So therefore, we want you to propose in this acquisition contract a cash sweep plan. So what is it exactly? This will mean that Colorspace will promise not to repatriate about 30% of capital for the next 2 years. So therefore, that will give India an incentive to have you come into their country, because that will only help them to prosper post-COVID or even during COVID. And that will also be able to create trust and build a rapport with the Indian government, which is key. Another thing to note here is there's a lot of uncertainty in India due to COVID, and also there's a different rule of law. So we want you also to consider getting the receivables insurance from EDC. And receivable insurance from EDC will further mitigate expansion in Mumbai, because things are different than in Canada or also in other countries you've expanded into. And so which will provide Colorspace the possibility, again, to further just focus on their core competency. It will give them the peace of mind. So how to win? This is important because we want you to make sure that you're able to adapt your Kaizen to the Indian culture. So Colorspace must tweak its recipe for success of using Kaizen to succeed in India. And this is something you've done so far when you expanded to China or other numerous countries. So key considerations here about India. It is more collectivist than Canada. Canada is about standard 80 on the individualist spectrum and Hofstede's insight, whereas India is at about a 48. When you expanded to China, that was stead at about 20. India is also a lot more relationship-based business, where in Canada, you're a lot more task-oriented. Another thing to note about Indians is they prefer indirect negative feedback, something quite similar to China. So therefore, for this, we have two specific recommendations for you. The first one being that you need to adopt a polycentric approach to management. So what does that mean exactly? Well, in India, you only have people from India actually working in your manufacturing, and especially that will be easier through the acquisition itself. There's no reason to bring anybody really from Winnipeg, a whole crew from Winnipeg, to go to India. And the reason for that, it's because first, a lot of Asian tech firms such as Samsung or Sony have actually used this method in India to succeed. But we still want somebody from Winnipeg to bring the Kaizen culture to India to really be able to implement it. And that will come from training, something that Cindy will explain to you a bit further into implementation. Another thing to note here is we want you to set up an internal anonymous reporting portal, which is something you've already had set up in China. And we want you to use this and implement it also in India, because again, consideration of India is a lot more collectivist in Canada, as well as reporting any feedback, taking into light the prefers of indirect negative feedback. Again, this will be something that will be critical to enforce, especially at the beginning, while you set up this whole Kaizen culture and your core competency in India for your long-term success. Now I'd like to pass it on to Cindy, who will explain to you exactly how you will be able to apply all of this for your success.
Thank you, Charlotte. So now let's take a deeper dive and look at the actionable steps that you can take to ensure that you have a robust plan for moving forward into India. So the first implementation phase we looked at is where to play. And the key goal here is to determine acquisition targets that best uphold Colorspace's operational excellence. So we broke this into two phases, the first being the planning phase and the second being the pitching phase. So when looking at the planning phase, the first step to take is market research. So it's looking at some key locations that you should expand to. And then afterwards, to form criteria for specific targets of manufacturing plants within those key locations that you previously outlined. And then last is to propose this acquisition and outline the targets as well, and to then further draft the contracts and also finalize the contract, which marks the end of the pitch phase. So I want to turn your attention to some of the key milestones in this entire process. The first of which is the forming of criteria for these target companies. So some key things to consider are, first of all, transportation infrastructure. So the way that your company is laid out is that the products that you sell are competing on costs, which means you need to keep things such as transportation costs at a low to ensure that you're still profitable and you can still garner some revenues. So it's important the locations you choose are transportation hubs to reduce these costs. Next, to look at is financial prudence. And lastly is to look at proximity to wholesalers. So part of your key value proposition is the customer intimacy that you can receive by planting locations close to wholesalers. So you have control over the local area and market and all those customers. And that's something that's important to uphold even through international expansion to areas such as India. Now, looking at the second key milestone, which is outlining potential targets. So the first thing to do is to draft a preliminary list of a lot of potential targets in the areas, and then continue to shortlist these companies that best fit and align with your outlined criteria, as mentioned earlier. And lastly is to contact these key companies and begin the negotiation process. So a key KPI that we identified is the annualized contract value, and the total cost of this first implementation is around 1.8 million in Canadian. Now looking at the second implementation process, which is how to enter. The key goal here is to navigate India's bureaucratic business landscape and business risk from COVID-19 in order to pave way for a seamless and smooth acquisition. So we also broke this into two phases. So the first of which is the planning phase and the last is the ensuring phase. So in the planning phase, it's important to form a business plan and also to draft a cash sweep plan. So why is this important? This is important because there's a lot of regulators within India, such as the Reserve Bank of India, and these bodies kind of look at foreign investment, and they've also outlined FDI. FDI is the Foreign Direct Investment Policy of India, which applies to manufacturing companies such as yours. So after identifying these key regulators, you need to be able to outline the positive economic impact for India and show that you are working in their favor as well. And by implementing a cash sweep plan, which is to not repatriate 30% of profits, you're showing that you are in alignment with their goals and needs moving into the future. Now, in terms of looking at insurance needs, first step is to reach out to the EDC and then outline your needs as well as confirming the insurance. So when outlining your insurance needs, there's three different types of insurance that EDC offers. The first of which is accounts receivables insurance. So this covers eventualities such as when foreign customers fail to pay. And then there's also contract frustration insurance, which is when EDC covers losses arising when customers go bankrupt or major contracts get canceled. And the last is political risk insurance. And this is for instability in foreign governments such as war and corruption. And we believe that the insurance that you should prioritize is the accounts receivables insurance, given that if some foreign customers that you may be wholesaling to, they might be struggling with COVID-19 and a loss in demand. So this would be able to help you cover some of those risks in case India's shutdown is extended above what you initially thought it would be. And this would just ensure that you can cover some of your losses. Now, looking at some of the key KPIs here, the one that I wanted to highlight is government relationships. So ensuring that and assessing whether your relationship with the government is strong and will continue to be strong is important given the bureaucratic nature of India. And the total cost for this implementation is around 230,000 Canadian. Now, looking at the last implementation process, which is how to win, the key goal here is to effectively integrate your Kaizen philosophy into India while remaining cognizant of all these cultural nuances that were mentioned earlier. So the first phase, which is to plan, kind of just readies the HR team and assesses criteria that you need. And one of the key parts is to select the internal supervisor you'll be flying out. So some of the key criteria is their expertise in international expansion, as well as having a strong background in management and operations and the India business landscape. And now the second part that is most important is the onboarding of actual employees. So it's really important to emphasize buy-in here because India is a collectivist society. And it's also important to inject some of the other key considerations and cultural nuances, such as valuing relationships as well as not enjoying direct feedback. So some of the key steps in your change management process is forming a guiding coalition. So this is the process where an entire organization can uphold buy-in because there's people at all levels advocating for change. And then the next part is announcing stakeholder benefits to uphold transparency and also to collect anonymous feedback. And the key KPI here is employee satisfaction as well as retention with a total cost of 400,000 Canadian. Now, looking at risks and mitigation. So one key risk is that COVID restrictions may intensify, and this is a prevalent risk, especially in India, given their high number of cases. So the mitigation here is to delay the pilot to more favorable conditions, and a contingency is reevaluating other geos for international expansion. Now I'd like to pass it to Kevin to close.
Thank you. So let's walk through the journey that we took today because we've carefully analyzed the different markets that you were planning to enter. We've given you a recommendation on where exactly to enter. And ultimately, we've given you a variety of tools to ensure that that entrance is successful. Thank you. And we can't wait to see which horizons you'll reach for next.
All right, we will initially start our question and answer period. I will first call on Herb.
A great presentation. Just a question around the piece of equipment we have at our headquarters and what the plans were going to be with that given our upgrades.
Of course, yeah. So we've actually considered that in understanding sort of how to enter. And part of those details include what exactly that role of equipment is going to be. And because we have it currently sitting around, I think it's very flexible as to the outcome of this piece of equipment. We can use it as equity in the acquisition, or depending on the size of the firm and their infrastructure that they currently have, we can opt to straight up import it in and supplement the production capabilities of that facility.
Thank you.
Our second question will come from Randy.
Thank you. Good presentation. Can you please go back to the slide where you discussed the cash sweep? It actually appeared on a couple of different slides, but explain how it works, because I'm frankly not familiar with that. I think you said it would you would agree to keep at least 30% of the profits in the Indian company. Is that right?
Yes, so cash sweep plans kind of work this way. It's an incentive for during international expansion for countries to accept that you come into their country. It's because it's a given benefit for them. So most of the time, if countries do expand to another, company extends to another country, they like to repatriate all the cash to their home office, to Winnipeg. However, by saying that we will be, that you will make sure to keep at least 30% of capital in India, that will only benefit the Indian government, and that will only help, GDP growth, economic development, and things like that. So for them, it is an incentive for you to go in India and to really, especially if there's any competitors, if they need to choose between a few different people, that will only be an incentive because it will help India and the government itself.
Okay, thank you.
Our third question will be from Hayden.
Hi, thanks, and good presentation. My question is, if you considered the effect of artificial intelligence and automation within local headquarters, and the potential impact that would have on international expansion strategy.
So what's really great about India is that it's a good business fit for AI, given that they are highly receptive to high-tech adoption rates compared to a lot of different countries we looked at. So that's something that would ideally be welcomed. And furthermore, with an acquisition, you can kind of look at the workforce and you're kind of starting fresh to see what your workforce needs are. So in an HR approach, it is also fairly simple, just given that you can outline your supply needs and see what is needed in terms of AI, and then you can kind of mold the workforce in accordance to that rather than having done it in another way.
If we've got time, I'll ask another one. In terms of core values of the partner that you'd be looking to acquire a division from, could you elaborate a bit on that and what would be ideal?
Yeah, so when we look at an ideal acquisition target, we're definitely not only forming criteria about where they are and like what they do, but also about what they value. And where that comes in to be very important is how readily they'll accept Kaizen once we introduce it. And so when we understand that sort of importance, we logically draw the conclusion that we should be finding companies that do have those core competencies of operational efficiency and have that drive for quality at every level. And alongside that, there's also that receptiveness to change and openness and transparency and communication. Of course, these things are harder to evaluate over Zoom rather than in-person site checks. However, we understand that we're able to still evaluate these measures through extensive company research and relationship building, as you have been for the last number of years. And we're confident that we'll be able to find an acquisition target that fits our needs, especially considering the huge scale of the market in India.
Great, thanks.
All right, thank you everyone for participating today. That concludes the presentation. We now ask that everyone officially leave the Zoom call. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.